Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this sun of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house, deep in the bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms held up for monuments, our stern alarums turned to merry meetings, our deadly marches to delightful measures. Grim-visaged war hath smoothed his wrinkled front, so now, instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearsome adversary, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasings of a lute. The first scene of the first act of Shakespeare's The Tragical History of King Richard III is an info dump. It tells everything, shows nothing. It is the sort of writing that, if it were to be put through the dogmatic rule of show don't tell, would be laughed out of the classroom and the editor's office. Now, granted, it is tremendously unfair to take a piece of dramatic writing and hold it up to support an argument that is aimed at an audience who is working almost exclusively in prose fiction. But the question remains, why do writers like Shakespeare and thousands of others throughout the English language canon get away with telling when really they should only ever be showing? Because they're good at it. Good evening, my gruesome little people, and welcome especially to those of you who may have stumbled across this channel for the very first time, for reasons we will go into for a moment. For those of you who are here for the very first time, welcome to What Now? This is the What Now Vault, a monochrome Aladdin's cave and dwelling place, if not indeed capital city of the chaotic ink goblin faction of the AuthorTube community, which I think may very well be why I'm here speaking to you. Yes, courtesy of the one and the only, indeed they are a remarkably endangered species, story detective, I am taking part in Wordstock, a series of short seminar videos of authortubers, booktubers, I think, various tubey people who will be reacting to one common stimuli that is, and the stimuli in this case that I have been given after watching and marvelling at the subtleties and succinctness of different aspects of the literary craft from others. I have been given, indeed we have been given, show, don't tell. This is because, if you haven't worked it out by now, I am a tremendously bad boy and I must be punished. Show, don't tell is a rule. And here among the chaotic ink goblins, we don't like rules. We like options. So here I am going to try and make a very short argument that showing rather than telling is an option rather than a hard and fast rule that can make or break a manuscript. Won't that be exciting, boys and girls? Let me just tuck in a little closer so you can get a better look at my war crime of a face. Show, don't tell is a pernicious little dictum. It is a virological little idiom, and it is everywhere. It works its way into the mindsets of writers no matter where or how they start upon this journey, whether they're teaching themselves through use of style guides or indeed online seminars like this, or the poor fools like me who actually went into academia to study it. You will find the principles of show, don't tell, and 9 times out of 10, that's all you will find. It is perfectly sage advice, but it is a very simple idea, and simple ideas are dangerous things because they're easily replicated, easily passed on to other people, easily get into the brain and become modifiers of behaviour, but they are tremendously difficult to open up. They do not stand up to close scrutiny or the paradoxes that they bring along with them. In this respect, brothers and sisters, I am afraid to say that in the age we live in, show don't tell has become a little bit of a dogma. I mean, for all I know, there may, yes indeed, have been some sort of literati Moses who descended from an appropriately proportioned mountain to give us this single commandment of show don't tell, but I never laid eyes on the man. I don't know anyone who did, so I'm inclined to take it with a little pinch of salt. In the spirit of full disclosure, I'm not saying it's a bad rule. I'm not saying you should just ignore it. It is a good rule. We will come onto that in a moment. What I'm saying is that I am fearful that there are young writers, and Jesus Christ, I can't believe that I've arrived at an age where I can't be considered a young writer, he said, staring at the grey in his fringe. But young writers who are fearful and trying to find their way in this, who are just gathering these rules and sticking them together and thinking, if I do this, it'll make for good writing. Because that isn't really the case, and I think the show don't tell fiasco of expression, because the problem is in the expression, not in the principle, is a good way of looking at that. Because as a single rule, it is the problem. Because really it should be many variations of a single principle. It should be things like show when, ellipses, and tell when, ellipses. Or show don't tell unless, tell if. There are very many variations of this. Or indeed, it is like when we were at little school and the teacher told us I before E except after C, which seemed perfectly reasonable at the time, but then you get to be a grown-up type person, like this handsome creature, and you discover that indeed the English language is littered with perfectly functional words that do not obey that rule. And for a slightly older example, just to beat this dead horse a little more, does anybody remember the 3 R's? Reading, writing, and arithmetic? As I say, show don't tell is a simple expression for a very complicated process. It's the same reason we like alliterations. They stick in the mind. Simple phrases to contain as much of an idea as possible stick in the brain. I mean, it takes 2 to salsa, it takes 2 to waltz, but you say it takes 2 to tango and people are likely to remember it. I have a particular bee in my bonnet over the dogmatic interpretation of show don't tell, but I will get to that at the end of this video. For starters, to really break into this and to hopefully not make Robert regret that he invited me to do this, I suppose I'd better talk about it properly, hadn't I? So first of all, let's talk about what I think showing is good for. And frankly, you don't need me to do this because I'm going to go out on a limb and say that a fair amount of the rest of this seminar series is going to be on that subject. But just so you know, I'm not bashing the principle. We will talk about what showing is good for. The principal benefit of showing your story, of using examined detail rather than expository or explanatory information and dialogue, it can be summed up in a single word, and that word is immersion. This is best expressed in a first-person narrative or a third-person closed narrative, where the information the reader is getting is the same as the viewpoint character at the same time that they get it. This maintains the immersion within the world, within the story, within the situation, because of the transfer of information from the character's world to the reader. All very well and good. You are maintaining that suspended disbelief. You are standing by John Gardner's fictive dream. There is no problem here. If you were in a first-person narrative and suddenly the viewpoint character goes off on a tangent and starts talking about God knows what, that suspension of disbelief is going to come right down. It also allows for a more vital and grounded sense of place within a narrative, because it keeps that eye. It keeps the eye of the reader through the eye of the character on the here and now of the narrative. And in that respect, this is something that isn't talked about very often, but I think is worth mentioning. The other major benefit of showing rather than telling is it allows the writer to set the clock. It's sort of the metronomic, it's the movement of the planets within the story. It gives a sense of time that is not an abstract fluidity, but rather there is a more cemented, solid, that was not my bones, that was my rings, but there we are. I really must stop doing things with my hands out of view of the camera. What am I doing? You don't know. Am I flipping you off? There's no way of knowing. No, why would I do that? You're lovely. We're going to be friends, you and I. Especially you. Especially you. I can't show you that we will, but I'll tell you. Of course, the culture in which we are all writing celebrates expansive worlds within a narrative, whether they're fantastical or grounded very firmly in reality. People, the reading audience of today really enjoys their expanded horizons, and the problem with showing rather than telling, particularly if you have a limited POV character, be that first person or third person limited. I don't know why I said closed earlier. I'm working off a script, it's what I do here. It's a problem when you take one of those POV characters and try to meet the audience's expectations for an expansive world, is you are very limited in what you can do, and you run the risk of your viewpoint character constantly reading newspapers or watching the television or running into unlikely characters. That doesn't necessarily bring the suspension of disbelief down, but it does fray at the rope from which the audience is suspending it just a little. Now, I don't have much in the way of proof for this, so consider it a working hypothesis rather than a theory that I've cooked up here in the What Now vault for observation. But has anybody else noticed how, since the idea of show don't tell took on a viral mechanism amongst the minds of would-be writers, how the number of multi-first-person POV books has gone all the way up? Because that's one way around it. Having multiple viewpoint characters, the more the better, is one way of keeping it out of it. Now, that would seem to be perfectly fine and dandy, thank you very much. Yes, I will take another drink. What a lovely summer's afternoon it is too. Except, no, because the human mind cannot help itself. So consider first-person narratives, for instance, and if you are exclusively showing rather than telling, with a first-person narrator, how do you know that you're not being told anything? It is so easy to wander over the border into the unreliable narrator. I mean, when it comes to backstory, Nick Carraway tells you a lot. He shows you a lot as well, but for things that he isn't immediately present for, he tells you. Now here's the question, how can you trust Nick Carraway? What, because in the first few lines he says you can? Come now. And through this we stumble drunkenly and dazed upon the first instance where I think telling rather than showing is not only perfectly acceptable, but in a fair few cases necessary to save the narrative, and that being narrative summary. Now again, it is perfectly acceptable if you are sticking strictly to the rule of show don't tell. You can end a passage, skip forward however much of a time frame you want to without explanation, pick it up again exactly where it was. That's fine, but if there has been important information that for the sake of narrative utility you don't want to be building chapters out of, your hands are tied. You're going to have to tell. Likewise, if, like me and many a chaotic ink goblin, you love your free indirect speech and you roam from head to head of characters up and down time of reckless abandon, well, you may very well go from sitting within the head of one character and showing all, telling nothing, but then it's nice to have a mechanism by which you can pull out, roam around the ether for a while, and then stick back down into another one. I dare say that a novel that was pure tell would be as dull as any novel that was pure show, to me anyway. I find the idea of this stringent binding of POV and of information to be a sort of gag, a sort of brace. I feel like I can't move within them, but that's personal taste, so I will not linger upon that argument. Because telling allows fluidity. Now, it should be used sparingly, it should be used very deliberately, not just for the sake of, oh wait, I just got to tell you this bit, you know? It has to have a purpose in it. I think the audience will spot otherwise and it just becomes lazy. But for all of this, I have never in all my years come across a decent argument for why telling is bad. Ever. I have never... It's not even that I've come across bad arguments, just nobody has ever bothered to... It's just a received wisdom. Oh no, don't tell your story. As well, I beg your pardon, but if nobody ever told me stories, how the fuck would I have learned how to read? As a brief tangent, John Gardner lists 3 principal types of story. Indeed, there is not just one. He argues there are 3 major families of them. Them being the realist story, which is probably where the majority of the showing over and telling goes. The tale, which I think is more where I sit. The kind of thing I write is probably more in the tale category. And then there's the yarn, which is all more anecdotal. Yeah, you'd get the way stories are told from person to person is best summed up in the yarn. And all of these require a different ratio between telling and showing, and that is the principal point. I am absolutely convinced, because I cannot think of a time in my life where I have ever read a book that was just one or the other. It is about the balance between the two. It is about knowing when to tell and when to show. And I'm sorry, I'm really, really sorry, because I wish I could, but the thing is, no one can teach you that. There is not a university, there is not a college course, there is not an online pay $2,500 and I will make you a writer courses. For all the beautiful and wonderful people of AuthorTube, there isn't really anyone here who can teach it to you. You've got to learn it for yourself. Because like everything else you will take it from someone who is in a ridiculous amount of debt for having to learn this. All of these rules, not just show, don't tell, but all of these rules, they're not rules. They're options. Strictly speaking, they are tools. And it depends on what you're trying to say. There is an old maxim, I can't remember who said it because I am, if you can't tell, a wretched idiot of a human being, but the medium is the message. And this is strictly to do with how a story is expressed, whether or not it's a short story or a novel or a film or a concept album or whatever. But I think the same is true of these maxims and these style guides and these anecdotes from other writers about how they do it. These are just tools. You're just building your toolbox. And yeah, a hammer is a fantastic tool to have, but not if you're trying to make a cake. If in your work you are struggling to think about whether you're telling too much or showing too little, the question you need to ask yourself is, does it work for what I'm trying to say? Now, if I say the story you're telling, I trust you know that I'm not saying you're telling, you know what I mean. What's it called? Yeah, that. I should have scripted this. Because here is the other thing that is left out of discourse too much, and so I am taking this opportunity as the Prime Minister of the Chaotic Ink Goblins to tell you, voice and style matter. You know that stupid bit I did at the very beginning when I was reading from Richard III and talked about Shakespeare and how other writers get away with telling because they're good at it? This is because their voice is so strong. Now, I have noticed there seems to be a little bit of a movement, certainly when I was studying, there's a little bit of a movement that seems to be very anti-writer, as if the writer should purge any sign of their own existence from out of the work, and I don't believe that for a moment, for a myriad of reasons. The principal one being that the entity that is the author is already a fiction that you've come up with. That's for a different video. The voice within your work is the important thing. Now, if you think that you have stumbled upon a section where you are telling too much, I would argue that don't worry about the fact that you've been telling. Start worrying about how you're telling it. Your audience will not notice, and indeed they may very well love a well-written passage of telling over a hastily cut to pieces to turn it into a showing section. Remember, these tools exist for your use. You do not exist for their use. Frankly, if you want to write your urban fantasy epic and tell the whole thing, start it with Once Upon a Time. I do not care. It's yours. It is all yours, and you must bend these rules to your will. So the only advice I can give, and I'm presuming I'm here to give advice, I can't imagine why I would have been invited otherwise, is to work on an intuition of your own as to when to show, when to tell, when you need to do the one or the other. There are times when you can blend them together and create new, exciting prose on the page, but the point is you must find your way of doing it. And I'm sorry, as I said earlier, there is no one who can teach you that. You've got to find it for yourself, but that's why communities like this exist, so that we can help each other to find these things. I don't even know what I am geographically, so I'm fucked. So, that was an unscripted roundabout rant on show don't tell. Did I say rant? I of course meant highly informed and prepared seminar, as Mr. Robert Jones, the story detective, invited me to do so. Yes, what to do? Well, stick at it. Brave heart. I've got faith in you. Don't have faith in myself, but I've got faith in you. So, go forth, and don't forget, these bastards work for you, not the other way around. This has been What Now? Good evening.